This podcast is sponsored by A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London and Middlesex, both family-owned and operated. By Hyde Park Care Pharmacy. Experience the difference an independent pharmacy can make for you and your loved ones. Hyde Park Care Pharmacy offers personalized care, short wait time, very competitive pricing, easy transfer of your prescription, and much more. And by Molly Maid. During these times of COVID-19, it has never been more important to keep your family safe. With the Healthy Home Cleaning System, Molly Maid London is here to help. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. Today is a bonus episode. With so much division and disunity in our current climate, we offer this episode as a prayerful offering in hope for a better tomorrow. Today we welcome Brian Allain. Brian founded and leads the team that produces How to Heal Our Divides, a project aimed at building awareness of voices and organizations that are taking real action to address several serious, deep divides that have strong negative impacts on our society: racial, political, religious, and other types of divides. These are outlined in an incredible book with contributions from friends of the podcast Diana Butler Bass, Shane Claiborne, Brian McLaren, and many more. We talk about the book, our many divides, and the incredible people and organizations working to heal them.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever and whenever you may be. We're welcoming you back to another edition of the Vickers Crossing podcast. The Vickers Crossing is a virtual space where faith intersects with the public square. And season 6 well underway, and episode 3 for you today on
We're just clicking along.
The Vickers Crossing. We are, man, we are. I'm Rob Henderson from Holy Trinity St. Stephen's Anglican Church in London.
And I'm Kevin George. I'm from St. Aidan's Anglican Church up in the Northwest.
And my name is Ian, a content creator, producer, and the person who gets this podcast out to your ears. How you doing?
We're doing. So we got a great guest today, guys. We're going to be welcoming for season 6, episode 3, Brian Allain. And Brian is founder and also leads something called Writing for Your Life, something new I've just discovered this past week as we were preparing to meet Brian. It's a resource center. And they make conferences available for spiritual writers, which include the Publishing in Color Conference and series, which is intended to increase the number of books published by spiritual writers of color. Awesome. And Brian also founded and leads the team that produced Compassionate Christianity and How to Heal Our Divides. So we'll be talking about that today. And there it is. And Brian has developed and led spiritual writers conferences at places like Princeton Theological Seminary, Western Theological Seminary, Belmont University, many other schools. All of this as a second career, coming after some time as a successful business and technology leader in high tech. So Brian's got quite a resume, and this is right up our alley, talking about spiritual writing and books and things like that. So Brian will be joining us momentarily.
This guy comes to us as referred to us by Brian McLaren. And I said, Brian, what is this? He said, he's a Fortune 500 guy. This guy was the head of Fortune 500 companies. Wow. And he retired from all that, and he dedicates his whole life to his faith walk now and all these incredible things. So Brian's, he doesn't write the books, but he gets the books out. So should be an interesting guy. In the meantime, we want to offer an acknowledgement here as we set out today that the lands upon which we record this podcast are the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenapewauk, and Adowandaran peoples connected with the London Township and Sombre Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. These lands continue to be home to diverse Indigenous peoples whom we see as contemporary stewards of the land and people with whom we wish to work towards complete and whole reconciliation between all our peoples.
And let's take a quick moment, too, to thank our sponsors here on the Vickers Crossing podcast. We want to thank A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London Middlesex, both family-owned and operated. And our thanks to Dave Mullen and his staff at A. Miller George Funeral Home today.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, David. We just hired a new general manager in Montreal for the Montreal Canadiens.
Oh, yeah.
Ken Hughes. And I watched the interview last night, and I thought I was watching Dave Mullen.
Is that Dave?
He looks.
Doing a little
I think Dave is
Dave
sidelining as the GM of Les Canadiens de Montreal, and but they look alike, and he has similar manner. I said, my God, that guy reminds me so much of Dave Mullen. Anyway, Hyde Park Care Pharmacy, another sponsor, locally owned, locally operated, locally loved, certainly loved by us because Carol Basada and her friends over there, Miriam and Jinjin, and everybody at the pharmacy, Big Mike and Little Mike, we give thanks for everything you're doing to help us along as well.
That's me. Sorry, totally forgot. Last and certainly not least, you want to say a huge thank you to Molly Maid. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today.
Maybe we can get some ammonia to give so that he can sniff it like sniffing salts to bring him around. Like he sees a little jump over there.
I don't know what happened. I was just so out of it.
Well, when you roll out of bed half hour before we do these things.
Hold on.
He's been across town and back today.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I have been.
Hey, just a quick update because I know people have been waiting with bated breath to hear what happened with my Tim Hortons.
Yeah, I wanted to know for sure.
So just as a quick catch up, I had doing this hockey pick players that score goals on this Tim Hortons app, and I had 6 days in a row where I picked someone that scored a goal in the NHL, and if I had hit 7, I'd win a week's free coffee at Tim
And
Hortons.
you put all your eggs in the Toronto basket.
Right.
You had Spezza.
Three Toronto players. I had Spezza.
Yeah.
I had Morgan Riley.
Yep.
And I had the great Austin Matthews.
Captain Underpants.
How did it go?
All 3 of them crapped the bed last night.
All right. And once again, the Toronto Maple Leafs do not disappoint.
Right. And but at the same time, I'm not totally surprised because I've been laughing at and making fun of the Leafs for 40 years.
Yeah, you get what you paid for.
So this is kind of my comeuppance, as it were, that I would ask them to try to help me out to do something and win some coffee.
Yeah.
So anyway,
I wear this sweater because this is the last time Toronto won the Stanley Cup.
That's right. That's right. Guess how old I was, Ian?
Not old enough.
No.
Yeah.
I was 1 year old.
Mm-hmm.
Of course.
So it's been a while. So anyway, that's the update.
Okay.
Big update.
And so we also want to update you on upcoming guests here on the Vickers Crossing, as we always do. And it's time for our segment, Who in the World Did You Book This Week, Kevin?
Well, am I ever glad you asked who in the world we booked this week? I'd like drum roll, please. We booked CNN senior political analyst, best-selling author, USA Today columnist Kirsten Powers.
Wow.
Her book is called Saving Grace. Kirsten is actually quite a faith-filled person. And I think that shines through in the way she interacts when she's on panels on CNN, where there's seeming to be so many people who are polarized. Interesting, the topic we're talking about today as well.
Yeah.
But she tends to try and really bring a sense of grace to everything she does. So we're excited. We're just working on a date. We're back and forth with a couple emails there, nailing down a date that works in her very busy schedule, but we're grateful to her for getting back to us and agreeing to become a guest on the Vickers Crossing.
All right. Looking forward to that. And looking forward to talking to Brian Allain, who is joining us now. So we're going to bring him into the Zoom room and get things underway.
Come on in, Brian.
And Brian has joined us here on the Vickers Crossing podcast. Brian, so glad you could spend some time with us today. How are you doing?
Just fine. I appreciate you guys having me on here. It's a pleasure to speak with you about these things.
Great. Good. And whereabouts are you coming from today? Where are you for our listeners?
I live in central New Jersey, a small town called Freehold, sort of midway between Philadelphia and New York City.
All right. Very good. Very good. We've kind of had an East Coast theme going on the last little while, right? Because our first guest of the new season was in New York.
Yes. And, we had Aubrey Hendricks was on here to talk about Christians against Christianity.
And then yesterday, Danielle was from Massachusetts originally, I think.
That's right. Yep.
Yeah. New Jersey. So cool. Good.
Wow. So the Meadowlands, you're into the Devils, eh?
There we go.
Well, so I grew up outside of Chicago.
Oh, okay.
So, when I was
Hawks fan.
all these affinities, grew and became very strong. So yes,
Yeah.
I'm a Chicago Blackhawks, Chicago White Sox, Chicago Bears, and Chicago Bulls. I mean, to
Okay.
some degree, to the degree that
Okay.
I follow them. Which
Oh, I was going to ask when you said Chicago, whether it was Cubs or Sox. So South Side.
I grew up on the South Side. So
Yeah,
yes.
Right.
All
Cool.
right. Fantastic. Great city. I did my some studies at McCormick, and I used to get down there once or about 3 times a year for 3 years, and it was golden. But it's been a while now. So great city, and yeah, you hail from a good place. Anyway, let's jump right in. Let's start with how to heal our divides and what it's all about, because there is the book, which we have, which is fantastic, but it's an effort which sort of goes beyond that. The webpage for your organization, I'll quote from, says, if we didn't recognize them already, recent times have put a spotlight on several serious, deep divides that have strong negative impacts in our society: racial, political, religious, and other types of divides. Much has been written describing these divides and how they came about, or encouraging us to look deeply inside ourselves to discover our own flaws. All good things. But there needs to be more said regarding what we do about them. How to Heal Our Divides is a project aimed at building awareness of voices and organizations that are taking real action to address these issues. The project is not an attempt to gloss over serious problems or make happy, but instead to highlight tangible efforts that are solving problems, actually healing divides in effective and practical ways. Brian, I wonder if you can tell us more about how this came about, and along with that, why we shouldn't just write off those people, like, it's the
Those
people
other
that
people.
those other people, the people that we other, like, we seem to be so deeply divided nowadays. The temptation is to just say, well, it's pointless. But clearly you and your colleagues have a different idea about this. So please share with us how this came about and why we shouldn't write one another off.
Well, so there were 3 things that happened during the pandemic that I would say that spurred me to do this. One was just my growing frustration and observation that I'd never seen our society so polarized. And, what can we do about it, right? Well, I mean, it's easy to think as an individual, there's not much we can do. But I felt like I owe it to my kids, I owe it to my grandkids, to try to make the world a little bit better than what we're seeing it right now, instead of just leaving them a mess. The second thing is that I started reading more books during the pandemic.
Right.
And reading books about anti-racism, about some of the political, religious divide kinds of things. And as I mentioned, a lot of really good books, but I was a little bit frustrated that there wasn't much that talked about, okay, I get it, what do we do about it?
Right.
And then the third thing that I did during the pandemic is I started doing lots of video interviews myself, particularly with authors that were coming out with new books, because my other hat that I wear is called Writing for Your Life. Right. And I support authors. So I knew that all these friends of mine were not going to be having their speaking engagements, not going to be having their book tours. I wanted to help them get the word out about their books. So I did video interviews using Zoom, and I did other kinds of video interviews too. One series was called Reading Hope in Trying Times, where we just talked about, what books to read during the pandemic, things like that. So those 3 things: frustration over the polarization, reading books and being frustrated that there wasn't much practical about how to deal with these issues, and the third, doing these video interview series. Right. So first, my idea about how to heal our divides was, okay, after the election, let me do a video interview series, to talk about this with some, people. In particular, look for organizations and voices, as you've said, that are actually doing something practical, So then I thought, well, gee, why don't I ask these people I'm going to interview to write a chapter in a book? Yeah. And, we'll do that in addition to just video. Yeah. And so around the middle of November, I started socializing this idea with a few other folks. And by, kind of with the target of 25 to 30 contributors.
Oh, yeah. No, you got more than that.
By Christmas, I ended up overbooked. I was oversubscribed. There was so many people that said yes to doing it, not even knowing who else was going to be in the book, or, much else about the whole project. So I said, okay, well, it looks like I'm on to something here. So I decided to not only do a book and a video in a series, but turn the whole thing into a platform, meaning website, social media, email newsletters. There's now a podcast for How to Heal Our Divides.
Well done.
And video interviews, of course. So to make a long story short, we started the project then around, Thanksgiving of 2020. Independently published a book by May of 2021.
Wow.
So it came together that quickly in terms of, herding the cats, in terms of everyone submitting their chapters, getting them edited, doing the book cover design, et cetera, et cetera. And that was my objective, was to get it out as quickly as I could. I could have gone through a traditional publisher, but it would have been a much longer timeline. And I'm kind of impatient and felt that it was too timely to wait for that. So that's kind of the story behind how it happened. Now, the question you raise about why don't we just write those people off? Well, I have to admit to being tempted to do that myself, some of the time, over just frustration of the lack of communication, the lack of ability to deal with some of these things. But I keep going back to the fact that that just feels wrong. And again, I feel like we've kind of seen what that's led to. Right. In terms of the polarization that we've got. And I thought, well, I want to do whatever I possibly can to help make this a better world for my kids and grandkids. So there you have it.
Good for you. Good for you. Sounds like you really hit on something that was being waited, was sitting and waiting to take off. Everything just kind of happened, right? It was like,
it was. I mean, I didn't go looking to write a book.
Yeah.
I mean, that's not my thing. I work with all kinds of authors, but I'm not an author myself. And I didn't, people asked me before, Brian, why don't you write a book? I said, well, I don't want to do that because I wouldn't have time to do all these other things that I do.
Right.
Yeah.
But then when, this model kind of sprung up, literally, I thought, okay, well, this is something I can do. I can coordinate it.
Right.
Let all these other people do the writing about the important work that they're doing. And I guess I should mention in all of this too, you watch the nightly news, right? And there's all kinds of bad news that you hear about every day. Where's the good news?
Right.
Where's the hope? Where's the raising awareness of all the great things that people are doing to deal with some of these issues? So I thought, okay, that's another thing that I think is an important contribution to the book.
Well, that's a well put, actually. Like, I mean, we had a terrible, I was going to say tragedy, but beyond that, I mean, it's worse than that, because it was a terror attack in our city here of 500,000 people. We had a 20-year-old use his truck to mow down a Muslim family. And there were 4 people killed, and a 7-year-old boy who survived but lost his sister, his parents, and his grandmother, became orphaned in a moment. And then the result of that, though, was this community rallied, and there was a march on a Friday with 20,000 people in the streets. Wow. So when you talk about good news and bad news, like, one of the things the local news does, like all they do in all cities across North America, is at the end of the year, they did their top 10 stories, right? And the number one story was the terror attack. The number one story wasn't that 20,000 people in this city banded together 4 or 5 days later and said, no, this is not who we are, right? Like, this young man has been influenced by this fringe reality of hatred in these sort of white nationalist ideas and so on. But on a whole, we stand against that, right? And I reached out to someone I know who works at a local news channel and said, I said, for what it's worth, I think the number one story is the way people reacted to that.
Yes.
Not the act of hate itself, right? So I just find that interesting. I think you're right. The news will focus on, what's that saying? If it bleeds, it leads, right?
If it bleeds, it leads.
Yeah. I mean, it's terrible.
Yeah. It's so many great people in this book. It's like, wow. There's people, guys, I got all kinds of people to reach out to come on and talk about their own projects. But several of these people have been on here, like Shane Claiborne and Diana Butler Bass and Brian McLaren. Guthrie Graves Fitzsimmons is in here. A lot of our previous guests are in this book. One of the people I hadn't known about is talking about interfaith stuff, really going back to that conversation we just had. So I'm just wondering if, following on what you just said, the effort, as you said, was so many people responded to you. So there's a broadness to this, because it speaks about race, it speaks about politics, it speaks about religion, community, body image, gender. All of these things are written about in this book, and that's just to name some of them. You offer quite a few links to groups that are working at healing those divides, looking at the sheer number of ways in which we find ourselves divided. One of the questions that comes to mind is, what is the thread, I guess, that runs through all of that? Like, I mean, when you talk about healing those divides, whether they be racial or political or religious or whatever, what's sort of the thread that takes us through?
Well, I guess I view it as a couple things. And the first one I'm going to talk about, I'm certainly not trying to pat myself on the back, but it's really worth sharing, because I think it's a phenomenon that is not understood and completely overlooked. In 1984, when I was 28 years old, I started going over to Asia quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
I was in high tech. And at that point in time, I was part of a team that was examining potential offshore manufacturing. And what I saw was all these different countries and all these really smart people whose standard of living was far, far below what we had in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
There was this ridiculous gap. And I thought to myself, this is not sustainable.
No.
At some point in time, that gap is going to close. And all this affluence that we have taken for granted is going to begin to shrink. Mm-hmm. Because the Chinese or whoever else are going to figure out how to compete with us. Mm-hmm. And as we've seen, that's been the case in spades, right? So I thought to myself, what's going to happen when, all of us fat, dumb, and happy North Americans are going to face a reality where it's not going to be so easy for our children to do better than what we did, whatever better means, right?
Yeah.
Typically viewed economically.
Yeah.
So I thought, you know what? In one way or another, it's going to hit the fan.
Yeah.
And things are going to get ugly, because we're not going to know how as a society to take this.
Right.
I didn't know what that form it would take, but I think a lot of all of this higher degree of polarization, the divides increasing. Yeah. A lot of it's driven by economic anxiety and not seeing a future as bright for ourselves or our children or our grandchildren as what we thought was going to be the case. Yeah. So that's one thread. The other thread, quite frankly, is just greed for power and money. Mm. If you look at the root of racism, of political divides, all these other different kinds of things, it's those in power being greedy and not wanting to share it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that just, to me, underlies virtually all of this stuff.
Right. It's true.
And it's exacerbated by the first thread.
And that divide is getting wider, right? I mean, it's just this week we learned that, the top 3 or 4 have increased their net worth from $700 billion to $1.5 trillion. I think it was Colbert last night said you'd have to earn $1.5 million a day for what is it, 1,500 days or something like that. Like, it's some stupid number. Like, you could never. Yeah. And so in the meantime, many people across the United States are still making $7.85 an hour minimum wage.
Yeah. Right. And this is during the pandemic that happened.
That's right. This is during a time when so many suffered at the wealthiest of the, and I mean, you have an interesting perspective as well, because of course we didn't talk a lot about your background, but your background is in Fortune 500 companies. Yeah.
I mean, some of that and some startups.
Yeah. So, but you've seen this, like, just how these things rocket off. And as you say, when you travel the world, you see that there's a cost to a lot of that too, isn't there?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. The book, I think the book itself is as Kevin mentioned, it's a really neat compilation of some really dynamic people, and they're doing some real hard work and heavy lifting of trying to heal that which divides us. And Some of the work being done is really incredible, and some of the people who have made their own journeys away from hostility are also incredible. It takes a lot of guts, a lot of vulnerability to be able to put yourself out there and say, I was hostile to this or that, or and I needed to change that. But perhaps none more exemplify this than a gentleman by the name of Jeff Burns. And Jeff described himself as a rabid Islamophobe, hated Muslims for over 15 years, but he made this incredible journey, which also came at great cost in terms of his own tribe, right? His own, those that he connected to. I'm wondering if you could share some of Jeff's story and stories with our listeners today, because it's incredible stuff.
It really is. I mean, Jeff's a great guy. And, the transformation, as you said, that he made was very intense and difficult and dramatic. Mm-hmm. So let me just read a couple of, words from his chapter. Yeah. He says, some days it's still hard for me to remember that I was a rabid Islamophobe who hated Muslims for over 15 years. I wanted nothing to do with Muslims. I believed, like many other Americans, that they were intrinsically evil people. After a deep inner struggle, seeking God and personal study, I began to see them in a different light. Still, I was unwilling to move towards them in love, reconciliation, and friendship. But in February of 2005, I was having coffee at Starbucks on Creedmoor Road in Raleigh, North Carolina. I was deeply struggling about my new insights on Muslims and Islam, and I knew I had to resolve it. I prayed for God to give me a sign so clear I would never doubt that he wanted me to build bridges of love and peace between Muslims and Christians. Approximately a minute later, a little Muslim boy came to my table uninvited and said, "Sir, my name is Omar. I'm 5 years old and I'm here to teach you some Arabic." Omar was my sign from God. Yeah. Over the next 30 minutes, Omar tried to teach me the Arabic alphabet. And after my encounter with this precious Muslim child, all my hate for Muslims was gone. And God filled my heart with his love for these beautiful people that I once feared and hated. My Islamophobic days were over. That day was the moment in time that I became a peacemaker and a bridge builder, and I never looked back. Yeah. I mean, isn't that an amazing story?
That just blow you away. Yeah, that's amazing. Amazing stuff.
I just think, and I mean, there are tons of these in this book, folks. If you haven't picked it up, pick it up, because I mean, this is the sort of stuff that you get in here that goes to the heart of this thing that we're talking about, that these are not the stories that you see on the nightly news. Right. Yeah. But how incredible. And so he's got, he advocates something called the Peace Path model, which is an acronym. And I'll just share it with folks. P, participate in God's dream for the world. E, express God's love. A, advocate for the common good. C, communicate God's message of reconciliation in word and deed. And E, experience hospitality. That's the peace part of the peace path. And then path, the P in path, plant peacemaking communities. A, apply 5 practices. T, team up for service projects. And H, have people over for dinner. That's my favorite one, because I'm one of the fat guys you were talking about a minute ago. And so I just think that to read about this guy who was sort of one of these right-wing evangelical Muslim suspicious people, even more, well, he says Islamophobe, his words, not mine, to travel from that to where he is, and what's the bridge that joins it? It's a little kid named Omar.
Yeah.
Right.
Isn't that crazy?
It's a beautiful thing.
It is. Yeah. There's another acronym I want to throw your way, which is, I'm just going to make it up on my own because it's not really an acronym in the book, but it's HHH, which stands for head, heart, and hands. Yes. And it comes from one of the contributors of the book, Amy Julia Becker, who wrote White Picket Fences. And she did this essay titled HHH, Head, Heart, Hands, a holistic response to the harms of social divisions. And the basic premise of this is that in order to participate in healing our social divisions, we need to understand the problem, which is the head aspect of things, right? Then to receive spiritual strength and nourishment and connect with others, that's the heart work, the second H. And then take meaningful ongoing actions, and that's the third H, which is hands. And we can do that in small, messy, local ways that might be available to us. And she writes that when it comes to taking action, there are 3 ways we can participate in healing social divisions. And one we can make is individual changes. 2, we can use our influence to enact change. And 3, we can work toward institutional change. So it's the last one I want to kind of pick up on. She points out that institutions are conservative by nature. They think they need to remain consistent and predictable in order to flourish. And yet that same conservative stability can mean institutions can become easily entrenched in historic injustices. And she raises the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s as an example of a movement that demonstrated most clearly the complexity and possibility of institutional change. And I can't help but ask, are we recording this today, right? The day after the Senate of the US failed to pass a motion that would have allowed for legislative change to protect voter rights. Several states are hard at work passing legislation to actually restrict access to votes in ways that will disproportionately affect racialized communities. I mean, the question is, like, what do Americans do with that? And how do the faithful kind of band together to protect voting rights in a climate where one of the two major political parties continues to spread the lie that there's this widespread voter fraud across the US? And I'm sure, this is what you're dealing with, Brian, and those around you. How do you move forward with that?
Well, first of all, it's just so hard for me to believe that some of this kind of stuff has happened.
Yeah.
Right. Some of the stuff that have been done politically within the United States, it's just, a president gets caught red-handed trying to bribe another government.
That's right.
Yeah.
And he doesn't get held accountable for it.
No.
I mean,
he's not going to get held accountable for basically inciting an insurrection on the very heart of your democracy. And the whole narrative in a matter of 12 months has changed. It's gone from a few of the Republicans sort of going, "Oh, this is bad, to now joining in the chorus of, it was just a demonstration. And right before your eyes, you can see it was. I mean, it's maddening to listen to people talk about this as if it was a nice day in Washington.
Yeah. And now we got this voting rights thing, right?
Yeah.
Which wild. Again is just like so obviously wrong.
Well, it feels like it's pulling your country back a long way.
Yeah. Well, some of the conversations I've had with folks, it's just like, okay, we're back to whatever, 1960 or something like that. Before, some of the civil rights legislation, it's that bad again.
Yeah.
But again, I want to give you some good news.
Good. That's why we have you here.
We need some of this.
There's an organization I just recently found out about. It's called Faiths, plural, Faiths United to Save Democracy. And it's, you can find a website for it. It's called turnoutsunday.com. TURNOUT Sunday.com. And it's a collaborative effort between Sojourners, the National African American Clergy Network, the Center on Faith and Justice, Georgetown University, and Skinner Leadership Institute.
Oh, all good places right there.
And they are doing work at national, local, state levels. For instance, on January 31st, they're having a webinar that's focused on Michigan. And I don't know what the situation is in Michigan in terms of, the timing of this. Maybe there's something coming up that, is an important vote or whatever. But it's a bunch of folks cooperating, across religions, across ethnicities, across et cetera, to try to do, a big part of it is, even with the national vote going the wrong way, even with the state legislatures in 19 different states enacting legislation that restricts voting, there's still things that people can do to try to get out the vote.
Yes.
And help that happen. So, there are, and Jim Wallace gave a really good presentation at the September 2021 Wild Goose Festival about all of this. And, that's how I first found out about it. But I also actually interviewed Adam Taylor the other day. Okay. And Adam is now the president of Sojourners. And he was telling me about this effort. And so, anyway, that's just one example.
I think too of people like Stacey Abrams, right, who's a deeply faithful
Yes.
person, and what she accomplished, along with others, she would be quick to add. But what she did in Georgia in the last presidential election was monumental. I mean, she moved mountains to register to vote. I mean, and this is off the heels of her dubious loss.
Exactly.
Right. I mean, her response to that was not to go away and pout and say, they stole the election. It was rigged. She didn't do any of that. Instead, she mobilized herself to do something, to use her hands, so to speak, to make an incredible difference. And we need more of that. And it's different here. We have a Westminster parliamentary system, but the issue is that there's still this sort of the erosion of rights for people who are most disenfranchised is seeping its way in different ways here. And so it becomes incumbent upon us who are on the progressive end of Christianity, I believe, to continue to advance ways to mobilize ourselves to do that work. So yeah, great stuff.
Important.
Oh, and Jim Wallace, if you're listening, we're looking for you. We need you on this podcast. So I'm gonna put this in Brian's trustworthy hands to connect us.
A friend of the podcast, Shane Claiborne, writes about humility in the book, and I'll read you some of what Shane wrote, and then I'll ask you a question on the other end of it. So he writes, Jesus did not come to make bad people good. Jesus came to bring dead people to life. Jesus didn't come to give us guilt, but to give us life. And there are a lot of people who are moral but mean. They may live responsibly, but they aren't much fun to be around. He goes on to write, I'd rather hang out with a humble conservative than a self-righteous liberal. And I'd rather hang out with a humble liberal than a self-righteous conservative. Humility is life-giving, and self-righteousness is always toxic. Shane goes on to say, G.K. Chesterton was once asked, what is the biggest problem in the world? The biggest obstacle to progress? And he answered with his characteristic wit, I am. What role does humility play in the healing of the divisions that you talk about?
Well, Shane, I think articulates that really well, doesn't he?
Yeah.
I think for me, humility, is a couple of different things. One is that it basically implies that we don't know everything. We're not always right. Mm-hmm. None of us are. Sure. So if you admit that and show to people that you admit that, that's one starting point to have a conversation, have a discussion about tough issues. The other thing is I think it helps put down the defenses, on both sides, so to speak, because any of these topics that we're talking about, it's really easy to quickly get into a shouting match, and just break down communication and discourse in a civil way very easily, very quickly. So, to the degree that you can enter into things, and I'm not trying to say that I'm the best at this by any means, but if you can enter into things with a humble heart and a focus on listening and trying to learn from the other person, I think Brian McLaren is an example of someone who does that incredibly well.
Yes, he does.
He's a role model for me in that regard, without question. I think that's, at least a start.
Yeah.
We have a relatively new segment here on the podcast. Listener questions. And it's a very special segment called Listener Questions, which is big, Brian. Huge, massive. Today's question.
Our listeners are burning questions.
Yeah. Right. It's like they're trying to take over the podcast. But today's question comes from the fantastic Jackie Taylor. Jackie's in St. Mary's, Ontario, home of the Canadian Baseball Hall of Fame, for those of you who are keeping tabs. She is a faithful listener of the Vicar's Crossing and an incredible witness on how to walk in the way of Jesus. Let's hear what Jackie has to ask.
Hello, and thank you for taking my question. Your book has given me a lot of hope, and it reminded me of a quote from Margaret Mead. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. My question is, have you seen activism rise in contrast to advocacy, especially in the political climate of today? Are we being called to be more activistic than advocates, or is it still a balance? Was it ever a balance? Thank you, and thank you again for editing the book. It really has given me hope.
What a great question. This whole balance between advocacy and activism is, an ongoing thread, right? I've seen a number of folks comment on that, and personally speaking, I do think it's a balance. There's not one right answer for every given situation. But one of my hopes for this book is to increase the amount of activism. Get people off their couch, and doing something.
I was going to say ass, but okay, couch.
So, at this point, given where we are, I'd certainly rather err in that direction.
Yeah.
I'm certainly seeing that in, I don't know if you've experienced this, Kevin, but in parish life as parish priests, certainly over the last few years, that when we have discussions as we do around social justice issues and things like that, I hear more and more people in the parish communities I've been involved with ask, what can we do, as opposed to just wanting to, I think years ago it was more about, well, that's interesting, I didn't know that before, and then we just leave it, right, and go back into our churches and do what we did. But now there's this need to be an activist in a sense, and it's starting to swell up in people, and I'm hearing that more and more, and even especially from people I never would have thought would want to be, for example, as Kevin said, going to that march back a year ago. They would have felt bad about it and talked about it and all that, but they would not have gone down and in the middle of a pandemic and walked down the street. So anyway, I see that in parish life, certainly, which I think is a good news for the church and good news for our culture and society.
And I wonder, Rob, as I listen to you say that too, I think about just what I think there's been a shift, and I'd be interested, Brian, to hear your thoughts on this. But I do believe that one of the things that's come along with this information age, in the sense that we have so much at our fingertips, is I do believe that a lot of people are becoming more aware. Like, I just watched the fallout of Black Lives Matter after George Floyd's murder, Breonna Taylor and others. There are people in my own social circle, my own family circle, my own reality, that, like Rob was saying about our parishes, I would not necessarily have thought would be moved by such things, who are now moved by them, because there's no way to avoid, that 8.5 or 9 minute video of a knee on a man's neck as he screamed for his mama, and there's no way here in London, for instance, to not empathize with that 7-year-old kid, right? Like, it's here in Canada, we're dealing with the fallout of residential schooling with our Indigenous siblings, and now the unearthing of thousands of children's bodies buried on school grounds. And I think that there's a shift, and so that movement from as the other author spoke about, from heart to hand, to actually being motivated to do something. I think we have a very unique opportunity before us because of the fact that people have so much available to them. I mean, if people remain ignorant in the sense that they never see it, they never hear it, and they can be willfully ignorant, that's one thing. But when it's really in your face, it's hard to remain there. No, Brian, I just wonder your thoughts on that.
No, I mean, that's the hope, honestly.
Right. Yeah.
Out of all of this, that things are getting bad enough that it's causing people to finally act.
Yeah. And I mean, as I hear people in racialized communities say, it's always been this bad, you're just starting to see it.
Exactly.
Right. Look, there's so much in this book we could talk about. We'd have you here all day, and then that will be a thing because, I don't know, the Devils might be playing tonight. So I will say this, by the way, that the New Jersey Devils have a young fellow playing on their hockey team named Dawson Mercer. And Dawson Mercer is a young rookie. He's actually in the conversation for the Calder Trophy for Rookie of the Year. He's from Bay Roberts, Newfoundland. I'm from Newfoundland. My great niece, Joy, is a cousin to this boy, and they all love him back there, and they all know him. It's a town of like 8,000-10,000 people, and he's like the local celebrity now. And so I actually have been watching New Jersey games, so I can watch young Dawson Mercer. So I'm all about the devil. I don't know if you watch Seinfeld or not, but anyway, look, but let's finish up with a really neat piece. I really love Makoto Fujimura's chapter on culture. He's a Christian and he's an artist, and he does incredible work. And he's written elsewhere, of course, about culture care and the theology of making. But in speaking about culture care, he says culture and generative principles are not concepts only for Christian believers or churches or religious conversations. Culture care is everyone's business. Everyone can, and I gratefully acknowledge that many people from all sorts of backgrounds do, he writes, contribute to the common good. These conversations are open to all people of goodwill to make culture inhabitable, to make a place of nurture for creativity. We must all choose to give away beauty gratuitously. I just love that turn of phrase, to give away beauty gratuitously. And so I was really taken by, and he sums up his chapter with this piece called What If, which really embodies that business of giving away beauty gratuitously. And so I thought it'd be interesting for us to read this as a round, the four of us, a canon. And so we'll all take a line as we go along, and then we'll just chat about it on the other end, Brian. So this is called What If, and again, it's Makoto Fujimura. What if each of us endeavored to bring beauty into someone's life today in some small way?
What if we, by faith, saw each moment as a Genesis moment, and even saw the current problems we were facing as Genesis opportunities?
What if, instead of treating the independence and creativity of artists as problems to solve, we found in them opportunities for a new type of leadership in our current cultural flux?
What if artists became known for their generosity rather than only for their self-expression?
What if art school became a place to train culture care agents rather than a filter that lets through only artists who can, quote unquote, make it?
What if we considered our actions, decisions, and creative products in light of 500 years and multiple generations?
What if we started to transgress boundaries by integrating our faith, art, and life, and speaking boldly about them?
What a concept, right?
Yep.
What if we committed to speaking fresh creativity and vision into culture rather than denouncing and boycotting other cultural products?
What if we saw art as gift, not just as a commodity?
What if we empower the border stalkers in our communities, support them, and send them out?
What if we, like Mahalia Jackson, stood behind our preachers and leaders and exhorted them to tell them all about the dream?
What if we created songs to draw people into movements for justice and flourishing?
What if we made things in secret, like Emily Dickinson, knowing that the world may not yet be ready for our thoughts?
What if we became custodians of culture, willing to be demoted for standing up for what is right, but taking copious notes so we can challenge the status quo?
What if we assumed that relational and creative capital is infinite? What kind of effect would that have on our business practices?
What if we gifted photographs to share the light of the miraculous in people rather than taking photographs so that we can own and sell them?
That's right.
Yeah, this is fantastic.
Want to see my lunch? I took a picture of it. And put it on.
There you go.
And he goes on to encourage then at the end for everyone to sit and make their own what if list, right? And I just think that, you know, these concepts that are in here of gifting, of of art as gift and not just commodity, of speaking fresh creativity and vision into a culture rather than boycotting certain cultures because we're upset or pissed off today, you know, what if we considered our actions, decisions, and creative products in light of 500 years? It's sort of that 7 generations that our Indigenous siblings teach us here about, planning 7 generations ahead as they look 7 generations back. I just wonder, Brian, if you could share your reaction to that particular offering in the book, and to this notion of this powerful way of thinking with what if. I mean, John Caputo writes about it as a perhaps, the perhapsness of things. Your thoughts?
Well, so that chapter and the what ifs came out of Mako's book called Culture Care.
Okay.
And so all the other contributors to the How to Heal Our Divides book wrote new chapters.
Yeah.
But in this case, I already knew about his book. I read it. I, interviewed him about it. And I said, Mako, can we just take, a chapter out of your book and those what ifs and include them in this? And so he and InterVarsity Press, who was the publisher of his book, luckily said, yes, that'd be wonderful. We'd love for you to do that. So, I mean, all that because I was so impressed with what we had written originally. I said, okay, this just fits so well with this new book. I said, let's, include it. So that was kind of my reaction to what he did.
Yeah, it's the way we ought to be talking, I think, because it's hopeful, and it's to go back to the question Ian asked that Shane, which can you not love Shane, but around humility, it's a humble stance, because it's not definitive, right? It's what if, it's about the possibilities, the perhapsness. I really love it.
Exactly. Yeah, and I don't know where I heard it, but I still do it in those times, and we've all had them when things look really bleak, or you're afraid to make a decision or move forward in some way, and you play the what if game, and you start asking, what if this happened, and then what if as a cause of that happened, and you kind of keep asking the what if questions, and usually at the end you'll come to a place where you realize it's not so bad, that there's hope. And it's not the worst thing that possibly could happen to you. And it's a practice that I've used, and like Kevin says, it gives you that hope and that possibility. So certainly would encourage us to continue to do that.
Yeah, I mean, what if Jesus really meant it when he said to love your enemies?
Yeah, what if?
What a concept.
What would that look like?
What if his first public statement about social justice was really a manifesto in itself? It was its own declaration of how we should live. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, and to declare good news to the captives and so on. So there's just I just love, there's so much in this book, folks. If you've not seen or heard about it, get it. But there's a number of web pages you should visit, and I'm going to invite Brian to tell you about those, because and I mean, maybe a word, because tell people about Writing for Your Life and what you're up to there, and people can visit these websites because you're doing some incredible work.
Oh, well, thank you so much. So the first website is for the book, How to Heal Our Divides, and it's literally howtohealourdivides.com, all strung together with no spaces. So that talks about not just the book, but all these organizations that are highlighted in the book, as well as the authors who contributed chapters. There's links to their websites. And oh, by the way, I'm in the process of putting together a second book.
All right.
That is similar to the first, but with a whole new set of authors and organizations that we're highlighting. So, stay tuned for that.
Awesome.
Good.
Another project that you mentioned is called Writing for Your Life. And that's actually the first of these that I'm going to tell you about that I launched. 5.5 years ago, I turned 60 and I decided, what do I want to do the rest of my life? I'd been in high tech most of my life, and then I ended up working for Frederick Buechner and his family to launch the Frederick Buechner Center and bring him online. So that's what kind of got me involved in the whole, Christian publishing arena. So Writing for Your Life is a resource center for spiritual writers. So we try to give away as many things for free as we can: articles, videos, resource guides, downloadable stuff. And then we do writers conferences. And initially those were in person. The last 2 years they've been online. So that's what Writing for Your Life is all about. And again, writingforyourlife.com, just all run together. An outgrowth of that effort is another project called Publishing in Color. And that one surprise, surprise, is publishingincolor.com. And that is a conference series specifically oriented toward fostering relationships between writers of color and people from the publishing industry. Forever, it's been the case that writers of color have really been underrepresented in terms of the number of books get published. So I thought, well, I'm not a literary agent, I'm not an editor, I'm not a publishing executive, never been any of those things, but everywhere I've ever been in business, so much matters on who you know and who knows you. So I thought, let me put together this, conference series that allows those relationships to build and grow. And then the fourth project that I launched about 2.5 years ago is called Compassionate Christianity. And so you can find that at compassionatechristianity.org.
How do you come up with these names? Like, I mean, these web page domains are really incredible.
Well, branding is a really difficult thing, quite frankly. And I didn't even know what to call Compassionate Christianity for a while. I was struggling with that. And at one of my writers' conferences, John Pavlovich was one of the keynote speakers. Yes. And during his talk, he was talking about, it's all about compassion.
That's right.
And so I thought, okay, that's my term that I need to use for this.
So the question is, you said it was 5.5 years ago, you turned 60. You wondered what you were going to do. Are you still wondering? Because you seem fairly busy.
Well, even back in my high tech days, I always gravitated toward launching new things.
Yeah.
In particular, stuff that had never been done before.
Yeah.
So I was involved in the early days of cell phones way back when. I was involved in the early days of voice over the internet. Or video over the internet, like we're doing today.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm always kind of like looking for the next new shiny object to go after.
That's awesome.
Yeah, good for you.
And actually, Brian McLaren and I are working on something in that regard. It's too early to talk about it yet, but
and then you'll bring it here, though, right, to the Vickers Crossing?
Absolutely. When the time is right, I'd be glad to share it with you.
Perfect. Well, that's great. Hey, Brian, thanks so much for spending the time with us. This has really been neat and hopeful. And it's important. We need that right now. So thanks for all the work you've done, and we appreciate your time here on the Vickers Crossing.
Well, thank you guys so much for all the work that you've done. I mean, you brought so much light to a lot of folks, both the folks that listen to your work as well as the people that participate, like myself. So really appreciate your efforts to help make the world a better place.
All right. Appreciate that. Thanks. And we'll let everybody know that How to Heal Our Divides is going to be available. You can find a link to it on our website, thevickerscrossing.com. And we'll look forward to having our listeners get some feedback to us on that too. So that's great. Brian, take care.
Let's go, Devils.
Thank you very much.
All right. Brian Allain, our guest today on the Vickers Crossing podcast. And again, thanks to Brian for his time. So that was great, guys.
Awesome.
Good to see you all again. Thanks to our sponsors here at the Vickers Crossing, to A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London, Middlesex, both family owned and operated. I think something came through my ceiling there, but I don't know what that was. To Hyde Park Hair Pharmacy, locally owned, locally operated, locally loved, and to our friends at Molly Maid. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today.
Clean it up.
Yeah.
Good. Thanks, guys. Good to see you. We'll see you next time on the Vickers Crossing, everyone. This has been a great bonus issue, and we appreciate everyone tuning in and listening to us because it would be a really boring podcast without anybody listening.
That's true.
So, we do
If
appreciate
a tree
you
falls
guys.
in the forest, does anybody
hear? I don't know.
Does it listen to the
Bruce
Vickers
Coburn?
Crossing?
Does it? I don't know. We'll have to ask it.
All right.
So great, guys. Take care. I'm Rob Henderson from Holy Trinity St. Stephen's.
Kevin George here over at St. Aidan's.
My name's Ian. Thank you for listening.
All right, Kevin. And remember, my friends, I want you to be safe. So always look both ways
before you cross the street, because there could be a ball hockey game going on or
Go Devils.
like that. Go Devils.
Thank you for listening. Our hosts are Kevin George and Rob Henderson. Our producer and composer is myself, Ian, with original artwork done by Elizabeth Dodman. If you have any questions or want to know where to find us, tweet us at Vickers Crossing or find us on Facebook at The Vickers Crossing. If you have any other questions about anything heard on this podcast, leave us a comment or look in the description to find out more. Thanks!